So with us is Alexei Kapterev. Alexei, welcome.
For the next 40 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, I will be swimming against the current. I will be talking about the dangers of storytelling, and of course I will be using stories. What choice do I have to illustrate some of my points? You see, I was working as a presentation skills trainer and consultant, and I'm still working as a presentation skills trainer and consultant since 2007, I think, and I began doing it largely because of the storytelling revolution that happened somewhere around this time. You see, one of the key reasons why I do what I do can be summarized in just 3 letters. TED, TED, the conference. In about 2006, they started putting their talks online. And I was so impressed by the talks, so completely blown away by the speakers that within a year, I left my steady job at a consulting company where I was working at the time to become a full-time presentation skills coach and trainer. No regrets. And because TED is so dear to my heart, I decided to begin this talk with a case study from TED. The case study, which I believe is one of the most spectacular failures of storytelling. This is a story, and it begins in 2012. In 2012, at the time, TED was flying high. It was a marvelous success. They were truly unique in the presentation space. They had a very unique and powerful brand promise. They promised to deliver content which was relevant, accessible, that is easy to digest, and reliable. They were trustworthy. They were the good guys. They weren't the sleazy, manipulative used car salespeople. And I'm saying were because by now they've unfortunately lost some of my trust and probably some of yours too. This is a Google Trends chart for TED as in conference. And as you can see, my beloved TED is going through a process of slow demise. And that demise started somewhere around mid-2012. Now, what happened in 2012, I hear you asking? Well, TED happened. The greatest TED of all, TED Global, I think it was in Vancouver. And at this event, and this is probably just a coincidence, but at this very event, Amy Cuddy, then assistant professor at Harvard Business School, delivered her greatest presentation, and the subject of her talk was has everything to do with this conference. It was a talk on body language, non-verbal displays, and their influence on presentations, as well as various life outcomes. This is a phenomenal presentation. To date, it generated over 60 million views. This is the second, I think, most viewed presentation at TED. And I cannot compliment this talk well enough. This is an amazing talk. I recently watched it again, and it still makes me shiver, even though I disagree with it almost entirely. So in this talk, she asked 2 questions. Question 1, can you, by assuming a certain posture, change your propensity to gamble? Interesting question. And the second, can this also change the level of your hormones? That is testosterone, which is associated with confidence, and cortisol, which is known as a stress hormone. Very interesting questions indeed. In case you didn't see the talk, these are the poses. Expansive on the left, these are good for you. Contractive on the right, nothing surprising. Any public speaking coach will tell you slouching doesn't really help to project your charisma across the room. And these are the answers, these are the results. For those assuming power poses, the testosterone was up, the cortisol was down, and the propensity to gamble was up too. That means these people became better risk takers. And these results are nothing short but spectacular. But you don't get 60 million views for that. What happened closer to the end? Cuddy told an extraordinary, powerful personal story about her surviving a car crash with some drastic health consequences. And then, despite this, by persevering, she achieved great academic success, all by living the mantra, fake it until you make it. Fake it until you make it. You see, it rhymes, therefore it's true. This is a slightly questionable motion, to put it mildly. But then, in the very end, she said that, you see, there are a lot of underprivileged people in the world, minorities, women, people of color. And she said that power poses can be their wonder weapon against oppression. Apparently, if you feel like you're oppressed, faking is perfectly fine. That's liberating, to say at least. And this is what you get 60 million views for. It's the moral premise. It's all about the moral premise of your talk. It's about your motive. Let me walk you through the chronology. In 2010, the original research article on which the talk was based had been accepted for publication in a proper peer-reviewed scientific psychological journal. In 2012, the TED Talk was recorded. There was a gap of 2 years. If there was something wrong with the article, they would have found something, right? But no, nobody cared right until the talk. In 2014, there was a researcher at the University of Zurich, Eva Reinhill, who tried to reproduce the results, failed miserably. Bummer, reportedly thought Kadib. In 2015, two researchers from Wharton, which is a competing business school, the irony, they analyzed 33 comparable studies and found that the average effect in these studies is very close to zero. In 2016, another researcher, whose name was Katie Garrison, she attempted a high-quality, large-scale replication with more than 300 people, zero effect again. In 2018, Kadi strikes back. She publishes her own meta-review, and now she claims only psychological effect exists, without any effects on hormone, the neuroendocrinal system. Basically, she proved that people enjoyed standing in power poses, which is not much of a discovery, if you ask me. And finally, last year, another meta-analysis was published, and now the researchers suggest that high power poses have no effect whatsoever, but slouching is really, really bad for you. And again, we're talking only about psychology, not about hormones. This is where we are now. So, let's make a mental note. When people preach, fake it until you make it. Be very, very cautious. Chances are they are actually practicing what they preach, which is, well, faking. Secondly, I hear you ask, Alexei, why do you call this the failure of storytelling? If anything, it's a remarkable success of storytelling. Rather, it's a failure of science. But I don't think it's a failure of science. You see, science is fundamentally a self-correcting enterprise. It's not perfect, but it should be self-correcting. This is what separates science from dogma. In science, error is just a natural part of discovery. And it wasn't a huge error. The consequences were reasonably mild. I mean, I don't believe anybody died as a result of this mistake or sustained any serious injury by standing like this. So I don't call this a failure because the premise of the talk is wrong. I think it's a failure because so far, TED failed to correct for the error. They didn't take down the talk. Instead, they posted this statement, which I'm pretty sure most viewers didn't see, and which they promised to keep up to date, and they don't. They just let Kadi to have the last word. And I understand them. 60 million views are very, very important. And there are loads of people still peddling this power poses nonsense. I hear this at every other soft skills gathering event. Luckily, not at this one, as far as I can remember. Now, this is how you lose trust as an institution. This is when the slow demise begins. And I believe this is the case where truth was completely overshadowed by good storytelling, by great storytelling. This is where storytelling becomes dangerous, when we stop caring about the facts and start caring about the entertainment or, I don't know, political value of the message. This is the real danger of storytelling. The real danger is not that stories don't work. They work spectacularly well. The real danger is that they work too well. They work so well that form completely overshadows the substance. This is not okay. As far as I'm concerned, this is not okay. I propose, for the purposes of this talk, we distinguish between two kinds of storytelling, two kinds of stories. Storytelling 1, stories as in telling anecdotes, case studies, small little vignettes we use to illustrate or entertain. And storytelling 2, which is using principles of drama, what the last session was about, to design the whole, I don't know, presentation or a book or a film doesn't matter in the end. So when we say, for instance, Mr. Gladwell is a brilliant storyteller, we mean simultaneously two things. We mean that one, he is great at having characters, so vivid they jump off the pages of his books and straight into our living rooms. And I think there's very little danger in that. I think it's a form of art, and art is there to be admired. But secondly, and more controversially, Mr. Gladwell is great at creating narratives. He is great at arranging small stories into large overarching schemes that aim to entertain, but also to persuade, to motivate, to sway us into a certain direction. And this is what he's mostly criticized for, not for his characters, but for his grand conclusions. His characters are great, and they're probably true to life, and I don't know, even then, if they're not, very few people would care. His grand conclusions, however, well, at least some of them anyway, are just plain wrong. Being a master storyteller in the first sense of the word is admirable and harmless. Being a master storyteller in the second sense is very, very dangerous. It's a great responsibility. And a lot of skeptics, I hear this all the time, they warn us about taking stories at face value as evidence. However, what they mostly mean, they mean stories in the first sense of the word, stories as anecdotes. I don't know, my great-grandmother smoked cigars and lived up to 100, these kinds of stories. And my belief are that these anecdotes are mostly harmless, because they're not particularly persuasive, you know. A lot of people seem to believe that anecdotes have some disproportionate impact compared to other forms of evidence. But there's actually very little evidence for that. Overall, statistical evidence exerts greater impact on persuasion than anecdotal evidence. We already have plenty of research, especially in the field of health communication. This is a very recent meta-analysis published just last year, aggregating results of, I think, more than 60 studies. It was clearly shown that, this is not the first time, by the way, that statistical significant evidence is superior to anecdotal. And I have to say that the difference is really, really small, by the way. To be perfectly honest, nothing really works. It's very hard to change people's minds, seriously. There was one important exception. We find anecdotal evidence to be more persuasive than statistical when emotional engagement is high, as when issues involve severe threat, health, or oneself. Again, it wasn't that big of a difference. Open the study, the link is down there, I think you'll get it. See the effect sizes, they are statistically significant, but very, very small. So, second reason I don't believe anecdotes are dangerous is because they are often accurate. Lots of skeptical people now seem to be saying, oh, personal story is not evidence. It is evidence. It is a very weak form of evidence, but it's evidence. It's called anecdotal evidence. Yes, a story can be twisted, and typically it is twisted, by the way. This is how stories work. They get twisted. They adapt to our imperfect memories. But so are the numbers. My own education is in finance, and I actually worked as a financial controller for 3 years. And I know you can massage numbers and they will tell the story you want them to tell. Not always, but frequently. You can. In fact, this is what probably happened in Cuddy's case. Either that or they got really, really unlucky. Statistics is the ultimate truth. But the process of gathering and analyzing statistical information is perilous. It's not without its problems. And stories, case studies, personal experiences should not be discarded. They should be examined. Jeff Bezos, who until recently was the CEO of Amazon, which is perhaps the most data-driven company in the world, they banned PowerPoint in this company because, according to them, they don't want charisma to prevail. Jeff Bezos wrote once that the thing I have noticed is that when anecdotes and the data disagree, the anecdotes are usually right. There is something wrong with the way you're measuring it. And I think he has the point, and this point becomes more and more recognized. Bank of England, I've heard, recently adopted a policy of having little informal meetings with business people to hear their stories, to better understand what's going on in the economy. And I applaud them for doing this. I think that requires courage. information they get from these interviews is, of course, meant to supplement the macroeconomic indicators, not to replace them. But they are doing this because economic indicators are not perfect. They had misled them on a number of occasions with some pretty drastic consequences, as you all know. So I don't worry much about anecdotes. I think they are useful and mostly harmless. Narratives, on the other hand, are quite different. Narratives is a different bunch of stories. The decisive operation on the Middle Eastern battlefield is narrative. Violence is still a crucial portion of armed conflict, but it ultimately serves a supporting role. ISIS and others use violence primarily to communicate, confirm, or advance their narrative. Now, this is another storytelling that I'm talking about. This is not to imply that ISIS were telling some nice little stories about Jihadi John or whoever. The narrative of ISIS is that the Americans came to the Middle East to replace Islam with Christianity. These kinds of narratives, grand narratives. Anecdotes describe events that took place over, I don't know, over lunch, over days, maybe months. The time span is small. Narratives describe events over decades, over centuries, sometimes even millennia. Narratives can consist of anecdotes, but they also might include some, convenient facts, scientific findings that confirm the grand conclusion, chains of logic, other things. All the narratives I can think of are us versus them situation. Steve Jobs, for the larger part of his life, was telling a grand narrative of Macs versus PCs. Conservatives versus liberals, US versus, what is it now, China and Russia. Stories and statistics is a narrative too. Stories versus statistics, what will prevail? So, this is the first problem with narratives. They are fundamentally adversarial. They are the weapons of war. One thing on which we hope our critics will agree with us, that a play should have conflict, says Lajos Ergi in his Art of Dramatic Writing. Conflict is the defining feature of narrative. You cannot have a narrative without conflict, which means that what you end up doing by following a narrative is waging a war, which is probably fine for a lot of people, I guess. Trouble is, when you are at war, it's unbelievably hard to admit mistakes. I don't know how Steve Jobs was doing it, but he was doing it. And what happened to Apple after Steve Jobs was gone is that Apple lost that ability. It took them, I don't know, 5 years to recognize that their keyboard design is not working. 5 bloody years. And this is exactly what happened to TED. They believe they are at war with injustice and oppression, and truth becomes, collateral damage. So, how about something other than war? I don't know, like maybe a conversation, a dialogue, a discussion where the goal is not to persuade, not to advance your agenda, but somehow to arrive closer to truth? Yeah, hopeless romanticism, I know. I don't think we will be able to get rid of conflict entirely, nor do we need to. It's a natural part of the universe. But sometimes we need to become slightly more, say, detached, slightly less emotional, slightly more objective. What's more, we need to focus on co-creation rather than on winning. Presenting to succeed, I know. And I think there are forms of communication that might give us just that. More on them in a couple of minutes, please forgive me, forgive the suspense. So, second problem with narrative is that narratives tend to oversimplify things. They make you think like you know something, which when in fact you don't. Stand in this posture for 2 minutes and not only it will guarantee your success in life, but it will also cure the society's ailments. How ridiculous is that in hindsight? Let me give you another example. Um, why do children turn out the way they do? 50 years ago, the answer was obvious. It's their upbringing, it's their parents, of course. 50 years ago, the dominant narrative in the psychological community was that parenting was pretty much the only reason. Nice parents had nice children, aggressive parents had aggressive children, high IQ parents had high IQ children. So there, what else could it be? And if there was something, I mean, anything wrong, problematic with a child, parents were to blame. We knew who the villain was, who the dragon was in this story. It was a simple and predictable world. But then a psychologist came along. His name was Judith Rich Harris. This is her book. And she asked a nagging little question. What's the evidence? And the answer was, well, we have those theories of Freud lying around since, I think, late 19th century. But other than that, we don't have much. But come on, I mean, what else could it be? Did you consider other factors, like genes, maybe? And this is exactly what it turned out to be, for the most part, at least. At the time, that is 25 years ago, there was already plenty of evidence that genes account for about 40 to 50% of variation in personality, for example, between people. Upbringing, something like 5% maybe, depending on what you measure. Not a whole lot. And the rest is school and just some random life experiences. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying, guilty. But notice that even at this level, the story is already too complex for quite a lot of people. Most academic psychologists know all this by now, but many practitioners in the field, psychotherapists that is, deny this because partly because they are so accustomed to blaming parents, but secondly, because it's an overly complex narrative to maintain. First, you no longer have the villain, but secondly, 4 factors, oh, we cannot handle this. So are you saying that parents don't matter? No, what I'm saying is that parents matter to a much smaller extent than we previously thought. Very complex thought. I think you see how this is a losing proposition. Falsehood flies while truth comes limping. I think this is the phrase. And what do you mean multiple factors? We can't handle that. One reason to do. When we read books about storytelling, they all tell us then one reason to do something is more than enough for a character. You don't need multiple reasons. And 40 to 50%, do you mean you're not sure? Freud was sure, he spoke with confidence, and confidence does prevail. Now, so it's too complex for a lot of people. They just can't handle that. And we become so accustomed to simple explanation that just happens to be wrong. I'm sorry, this is life. And life could be immensely complex. And we need something to communicate this complexity. And our over-reliance on narratives is failing us. I mean, it failed Ted. As a very influential economist, Tyler Cowen, in his hugely underrated TEDx talk, he said that every time you are telling good versus evil story, you are basically lowering your IQ by 10 points or more. What's more, I want to add, you are lowering your audience's IQ by 10 points or more. Now, of course, we shouldn't idolize IQ. It is but a tool. Too much IQ probably might be bad thing sometimes. We all know about paralysis by analysis, or as we say in Russia, woes of wit. We have a famous play by that name called exactly that. Sometimes the only way out of paralysis by analysis is to lower one's IQ and, just do. And this is what narratives are great for. Narratives produce motivation. Statistical evidence was found to have a stronger influence than narratives on beliefs and attitude, while narrative evidence had a stronger influence on intention. Simon Zebrugge says, of the University of Amsterdam. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the third problem with narratives. Narratives reduce IQ and produce motivation. Low IQ, high motivation. What can possibly go wrong? I mean, having confidence is really, really great. I'm saying this as somebody who was lacking confidence for the most part of my life. Unfortunately, and this is something I found the hard way, you also have to be confident in something that has at least some grounding in reality. And if it's not, then it's not confidence. You know what's the technical term for it? How psychologists call it? It is called overconfidence. Overconfidence. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the third danger of storytelling. Overconfidence is a powerful source of illusions, determined by the quality and coherence of the story that you're telling yourself, not by its validity. If people can construct simple and coherent story, they feel confident regardless of how well grounded it is in reality, says Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman. Let me give you another quote. Here's another from Mark Twain, written 150 years ago. All you need in this life is ignorance and confidence, and then success is sure. Timeless truth. Ignorance and confidence, ladies and gentlemen, delivered to you by storytelling. They never tell you about the ignorance part, do they? But this is true. Storytelling it's like chips and cola for your brain. It's very easy to digest, could be very bad for you in the long term. Should come with a big warning label. Danger contains storytelling. I must confess, 10 years ago, I wasn't aware of that. Bummer. So, what is the alternative? Is there any alternative at all? Can we stop telling and retelling narratives? I don't know, should we? I don't believe we can, and that we should. Stories are wonderful. We need stories. We need more stories. We need better stories. And I think scientists who create scientifically accurate narratives, and I hope this is not a misnomer, are doing a wonderful job. And some things really do need simplification. There's an enormous gap between science and lay people. But we, the lay people, the business people, we should be doing other parts of the job too. Stories are great, but sometimes we need other things, like tables and formulas and graphs and charts. And let us use stories when we care about entertainment and emotions and motivations. And let us use other things when we care primarily about truth. Let me give you a map with two axes. Expertise, which is an opposite of ignorance, if you will, and motivation. So this is a map of a magical kingdom. Here in the lower part, in the lower left part, we have a kingdom of goblins. They have low motivation and low expertise. What is the best communication tool here? Stories. Stories will produce higher motivated goblins, which is a very dangerous substance that needs to be handled with care. This is the danger of storytelling. Lower right corner, high expertise, low motivation. These creatures are called elves. They're very wise, not a lot of desire to do anything though. Stories won't work with them. They are far too wise. They will see right through your stories. You have to use numbers, specs, tiny little parameters, things only they could understand. You have to know the elvish language. Goblins are straightforward. They mostly care about, the bling. The secret to communicating with elves is knowing their language and their criteria for decision making. Upper left corner, high motivation, low expertise. Hobbits. Hobbits live here. Hobbits are very rare. They don't come in troves. Very motivated, very well-meaning, always need some consulting as to where exactly they should throw the bloody ring. What do we use here? Definitely not stories. They have no use for stories. They need a map. Actually, they are highly motivated, so you can throw almost anything at them. Charts, graphs, formulas. They're eager to learn. They desire complex content. Let them have it. Again, very rare creatures. People teaching at educational institutions, I think they overestimate the amount of hobbits in their vicinity. I think they mostly believe their students are hobbits, which is true if you're teaching at Harvard, but unless you're teaching at Harvard, this is probably a mistake. Mostly goblins, with a few hobbits, of course. By the end of the semester, all the hobbits become elves, very knowledgeable and very tired. Finally, upper right corner. Can you guess what's in there? High motivation, high expertise, There's like 8 characters in the whole Lord of the Rings that have both expertise and motivation, and about half of them are evil. Yeah, there's another hidden dimension in this map: good versus evil. Okay, I call these creatures wizards, and a talk with them is always a two-way conversation, never a monologue, always a dialogue. You need to co-create something with them. You throw them a story, they will throw another story at you back. And this is where I believe we are heading as a civilization. I think as we age as a civilization, more and more people become wizards. And wizards, at least as far as I'm concerned, are the most interesting people in the world. I would love to be able to talk to them. And what do you use when talking to them? I think you're using something like this. This is a logical structure of Emikadi's talk. It is called a decision graph, or sometimes influence diagram. I did a few of these graphs for a number of talks, and this one is just perfect. It is beautifully constructed, seriously. I mean, the talk, it is very well done. I admire the craftsmanship in planning as well as the masterful execution. So this is how things work for Emikadi. She begins with her first proposition that our nonverbal displays influence other people. So relatively obvious thing to say, but she backs it up with some evidence. Then she says, she says that our nonverbal displays influence how we think and feel. And again, she has some experiments by Fritz Strack to back it up. She then moves a little bit sideways and proposes that there are nonverbal signals of power and dominance. Again, reasonably obvious thing to say, but then she proposes that changing our nonverbal signals is the way to shift the balance of power, which is interesting. I mean, it is probably wrong, but it's an interesting thing to say. This is a problematic statement, but given all the background and her experiments, it doesn't look all that preposterous. And then she strikes the final blow by telling this powerful personal story, pointing out that females and minorities more frequently display signals of submission. And she concludes that the way out of this really abominable situation is to fake it until you make it. Wow, what a journey. These are the confidence levels. Green means good evidence, yellow means shaky evidence, red means very shaky evidence. Now, suppose we mostly care about the truth and don't care much about having 100% confidence. It's a trade-off. You can either have one or another. I think under these circumstances, you would very much like to be able to see something like this. Of course, this is hindsight. I can only assign those colors in retrospect. But I wonder what colors the author of this talk would assign herself. I don't know, something like this maybe? I would argue that this is still very informative, much more informative, in fact, than what we had before, which was an emotional impression and a questionable life hack. And I think we should start doing something like this for the purposes of internal communication, which I think is the least adversarial of all. With sales presentation, there's always this conflict of interest, which probably cannot be overcome in the near future. But for internal communication, probably. And at some point, people start complaining that it's too complex and too boring. And at this point, we should totally roll back to storytelling. Stories is our communication safety net. I think you can do those Bayesian graphs only if you know your storytelling well enough. See, it rhymes, therefore it's true. So, did I just give you the narrative? Oh, I think I did. Cut is the villain, truth is the victim, I am the savior, right? And we all know stories where saviors sacrifice themselves in the end. To continue the story, I have no other choice but to sacrifice myself on the altar of truth. Don't worry, I'm not gonna literally die. But I have to dissect my own narrative in the same manner I just dissected Cadiz. Let's see what we have. And you can already see that it's too complex. This talk will never get 60 million views. Now, I began with the Cadiz case. This is perhaps my biggest problem. I bash other people to advance my own narrative. Please forgive me. I had to bring it to the extreme to demonstrate the problem. Perhaps I'm the victim of my own attachment to narratives. Maybe one day I will learn how to do it in a nice, peaceful, non-adversarial Buddhist kind of way without being boring. Honestly, I would very much love to be able to do that. But let's also look at the logic. Now, I began by proposing that the danger of stories is that they work too well. I suggested to distinguish between anecdotes and narratives, and proposed that anecdotes are reasonably harmless. I then listed 3 problems with narratives: their adversarial nature, their tendency to oversimplify complex things, and their capacity to produce motivation. Ignorance, overconfidence, and desire to wage war is a very dangerous combination, I think. Okay, what's next? We need different tools for different contexts. And I gave you the Magical Kingdom map, which, by the way, is a heavily disguised academic model called Elaboration Likelihood Model by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, 2 social psychologists, American social psychologists. Then I propose we use graphs for internal communication. And these are my confidence levels, and you get this after the talk, and I invite you to find flaws in my reasoning, which I'm sure are numerous, and I promise not to treat you as an enemy, but as a fellow compatriot. And of course, if you're interested in studying and designing communication like this, let us have a chat. One final note. The presentation revolution, which brought me to this industry, the presentation revolution perpetuated by Steve Jobs and TED, was largely about a shift from informing to persuading. What they did, they moved away from the question, what am I going to say, to the question, what do I want my audience to feel, to believe, and ultimately to do? And I think now is the time for us to start moving to the next stage, which is about asking the question, how do we search for truth together with the audience? And I think this is the next stage. And I think this is about time we start moving there. And I'm not going to lie to you, it might take us a few decades. There are no easy money to be made there, I'm afraid. But hey, revolutions start small. Write me a note. Join the conspiracy. Solidarity, brothers.
Alexei, a lot of people in the chat, you'll see it later, a lot of people in the chat are like, they approached what you're saying with, you made them think. Okay, let's put it this way. You made them think quite a lot in regards to the topic itself. We have 4 minutes and we have 2 questions. So are you willing to answer those?
Yeah, sure.
Brilliant. One of them is, I think, not that much related to presentations, but probably people, because of your topic, are very curious to learn more about what's your take on it. And it's more or less related to how do you think we can handle the storm of misinformation and fake news, right? What is your take here?
I think our best weapons are Google, or I don't know, DuckDuckGo for those of you privacy minded, and Wikipedia. This is our best hopes to combat this. And Wikipedia is very, very accurate precisely because it's so easily editable. I think we find truth in a conversation, in letting people have a say.
Okay, that was a very straight to the point answer. All right, by the way, there was a very quick, I was looking at the chat while you were responding. There is a very interesting thought in the chat and a question. How do you define truth? You know, like, that obviously that's a very complicated question. It's not something that you are like, oh, I have the definition right now in front of me, here it is. But if you have to think about it, like if you have to brainstorm out loud, what would you say? Like, how do you define truth? You personally?
Yeah, I think the word science is the closest synonym to truth that we have, because of its fundamentally self-correcting nature. Truth is something you can only approach, not something you can have, and science is our best shot for the truth. For those of you who are really interested in truth, in theories of truth, I invite you to Google "You Can't Handle Truth" as a video by Caniades, I think was the name of the organization. They produce videos on various topics in philosophy, and they have a series of videos about different theories of truth. And this is the rabbit's hole. I mean, the truth is hard. Very few people can handle truth. But I think if I can pin it down to just one word, I think science is our best shot.
All right.
And therefore, scholar.google.com
Yeah.
is the link.
Yeah. Do you think that we have two more? So let's go, because we have the time and people are curious. So let's see how this goes. Do you think that we can categorize stories as something that more or less teleports our audience? Like, can we categorize them in something like this? That it can have the power of teleporting our audience?
Yeah, of course. I think there's even, it's called narrative transportation theory. This is exactly how it's called, narrative transportation. This is a phenomena that the stories transport us into different realities. This is why people tell that Steve Jobs had this, reality distortion field, which I think he really, really had. So stories are great when we're talking about the future, because you see there are no facts in the future. We're not yet there. So when it comes to future stories, I think are largely irreplaceable. But if we're talking about the past, then it's numbers, statistics.
Yeah. And one last here, which I believe is also very, very interesting by itself, is, okay, everyone here will try to fact check absolutely everything in their talks, right? But at the end of the day, it's not possible. Like, how do you not how do you not let your guard down? Like, you cannot check everything. Like, what do you do? What do you advise people?
Let other people correct your mistakes. This is what it's all about. You're absolutely right. You cannot fact check everything. Don't become defensive when other people tell you that your, link is not working, or that your story about the space pen is bogus, which it is, by the way. They're not always right, but have a conversation. Don't become defensive. Don't treat them as an adversary. Treat them as a friend.
Yeah. Alexei, that's it.
Cooperative communication.
That's it. We don't have more questions for you. The topic was incredible. The presentation was incredible. Made a lot of people think, including me, by the way, especially nowadays in this crazy world that we are living in. Thank you so much for joining. This was a huge pleasure to have you here.
Boris. Thank you so much for inviting me.